to Sense Space. Welcome to this series on wrestling with Christianity, within which this dialogue, more of an interview dialogue, is going to be sitting and contributing as part of that larger conversation. So, welcome, Dad. Good to have you
Hello,
back.
Jacob, son of mine.
Son of Gary, son of Leonard Kishere,
Yes,
son of England. Um,
I got introduced in a Russian speaking gathering in Moldova once, and they asked, "What's your dad's name?" And I said, "Why? Well, we need to introduce you through your dad." My dad had long been dead, but I thought it was cool to be introduced as Gary von Lenovich. I thought he would have had a little giggle at that.
well, that would make me Jacob von Garyvich, presumably.
It's not as cool, is it? Doesn't
No,
sound
it doesn't
Russian.
have. No. No, it doesn't. Interesting. Yes, you've been to a lot of funny gatherings over the
I
years and
have
around the
indeed.
world. Um, some of those in capacity as a Christian, as a speaker, explorer in Christian spaces.
Yeah,
Um, for a time as a minister, um, as a leader in a Christian community. Um, and those days are long since past, but from what I understand, you still find yourself to be walking on a road in relationship to Christ or in relationship to spirit, um, long having departed from what's formerly called church. And I think you could probably offer some helpful distinctions and definitions about what we mean by church. And what I really wanted to get into today was exploring the meaning of church and where church has gone wrong
okay.
in your experience, and through the lens of your own journey, um, because there's a real big shift that occurs when you switch out of secular modern thinking into this other place where the story of Christ, the reality, the sort of holographic reality of Christ is this ever present force in reality. And there are all kinds of symptoms and different ways of speaking and moving that come with that. So, yeah, I'd love to
Indeed.
open that up.
I think that's a good starting place. I think that's one of the problems is that we have to switch out of norming it, or what I've since referred to as switch out of the real into the created, because most of the Jesus narratives still reside in a building in meetings and narrated by specialists, um, which means that we do step out of culture, whatever normal culture is. And then much of what we're doing is trying to find our way back. I always found it triggering when we were having a conversation about doing outreach. And I was going, you can only do outreach to a place that you've removed yourself from. And I'm like, okay, so we've created this other world. And my experience, even uh, becoming a Christian at 18, was definitely stepping into another world, which I didn't step out of again until 15, 16 years later.
Wow, that is a really significant chunk of time. I want to, yeah, maybe at some point we'll address the t-shirt and to what extent it's relevant to the conversation or just coincidental.
I chuck it in now,
Um,
it's a band, the
okay,
cult, with a great song called She Cell Sanctuary.
excellent.
There you go.
You were wearing a smart jumper before we started, but it
And
was
it
too
was just
hot.
way too
So,
hot because I'm in Athens, and even though it's just the end of March, it's decided it's going to be June.
mm, yeah, maybe that's something we'll touch on as well, is like what moving to a much more ostensibly Christian country, Orthodox Christian country, is how that's kind
Okay.
of added to the later stages of the reflection. But what was the quality of being immersed in that world for those 15 years? And how did that shape your reality?
I think it went from church attendance to participation, feeling that there are now these things literally at the front, which are deemed to be the sacred roles. And so your whole frame shifts to the things that God is more about and the things that God is less. And so I saw myself increasingly moving into meaning, purpose, and role as defined by the platform. And then suddenly you've got other roles in the church community, whether it's leading a group midweek or doing the children's work on a Sunday or being a youth worker. Those are all deemed sacred roles. So I found myself within that culture desiring to move towards meaning and purpose as far as I saw it in terms of the divine, which meant roles within the construct. And lo and behold, I found myself there. But I think quite early on, I discovered something I never since lost, which is critique. I wanted to know why, which I think was part of what comes in the package of the postmodern generation. Is we've moved from the parental do it because I said so and because you should without any explanation to, but why? I'm not settling for the anymore. I want to understand. Why was I saying that? I don't know. But yeah, sustaining a critique throughout, which eventually, 15 years later, led me out of what had the name church, but I never left church in my understanding. It was something I continued to explore and was very surprised with what that pursuit led me away from. Hmm.
Mm. So the journey started out just as a participant in a congregation, just attending
Yeah,
weekly services, participating in the music, finding presumably some sense of community um, that you weren't experiencing elsewhere. And then from that place, you got more involved. You became youth worker, youth counselor within that. And then what was the journey from that to um, speaking in front of the Bliss community regularly and yeah, like getting up on the stage, on the microphone, giving reflection, giving
yeah.
sermon, like what was that like to experience and um how did that change you? What was
Well,
required of you to
you
to
you
do
don't
that?
you don't tend to leave yourself at the door. And whilst part of the Christian narrative is it's a place that will aid you coming to wholeness, dealing with your baggage, healing your wounds, it offers an alternative family to probably what's been dysfunctional for you. It also sustains aspects of dysfunction and brokenness. So, being a counsellor now, I'm more than aware of rescue culture. And so I was a rescuer. And so if you're a rescuer in church, that gets affirmed because they need people who are there for everybody else. And so you're kind of pump primed for a role of caring within the Christian community with absolutely no critique or exploration of why you are primed to the needs of others so frequently beyond your own needs, why you so readily buy into a Christian narrative of self-sacrifice and over self-sacrificing to the point now that half of my clients are Christians that I counsel coming out of toxicity. Almost all of them are recovering from burnout, having been in a self-sacrificing culture that's nurtured them into sacred roles within the system And yet they're blowing up because what's being affirmed is actually some of their own unmet needs and brokenness. They are not giving out of what they have an abundance of, which is love and self-compassion. They're, they're giving out of what they've not yet fully received, often because they're so flowing out of a trauma sensitization, because they know what it is to not have. They're desperate to see nobody else suffer in the way that they have without getting healing themselves. And so I found myself in a role, and I found myself moving towards being a pastor of a church because I cared, and eventually burnt out, as one does.
That's really good. I think that's well, it's not good that you burned out. Maybe it is in the long run, but
I'd have still
it's
been there if I hadn't.
no, it's good that you've identified that. I think that's a really big piece of um the sort of the answer to the question where church has gone wrong. Um, I've seen that in myself. I've seen that in other people, that propensity to find one's sense of worth and value and wholeness in being involved in the rescuing and helping of others in a way that's actually not in some sort of sovereignty, some sort of balance in which
Yeah,
um, you're operating from a place of kind of a fuller cup, as you
yeah,
say. It's more just like I'm gonna pour myself out in a kind of self-sacrificial form of
yeah,
love that ultimately is undermining to my capacity to be fully there for
yeah.
myself or for other people.
And hopefully having the question, what need is this meeting in me? Because that is often an underlying part for people in all kinds of caring roles, whether it's in church world or healthcare workers. So
Mm,
many people come to the ends of themselves because their love and sensitization and compassion for others is often coming out of unmet needs. And I don't know, it's probably a proper phrase for it, but I'm calling it trauma sensitization at the moment.
mm. So were you involved in um, outreach? Were you involved in
Oh,
enrolling
yes.
people into church? Did you go out onto the streets and talk to random people? Did you try and invite friends from school or people who weren't in that community into it? What was that dynamic like?
Well, I think uh, both me and your mother stuck around as long as we did because we felt we were doing something radical. We felt that we were being countered to the culture of the church institution as a whole and bridging this gap between mainstream culture and the culture of the church by moving out and towards. And we were fortunate enough to be around a bunch of people in a church setup who allowed us to go and hang out with young people with no expectation of putting bums in pews on a Sunday morning, but exploring what faith and Christianity and journey might look for them. And that was very exciting to be permissioned because so many people in church are not permissioned to diversify or do anything different, and we were. But what we didn't know is we are churched. Probably takes about 10 minutes of being in church culture to become someone who is churched, and then your worldview and your paradigm are deeply impacted by that. And so once you're churched, an incremental adjustment or change feels intensely dynamic. And so we moved increasingly out into the community, working with young people through rave culture, finding through relationship building, people being interested in why we were hanging out, 40 young people coming to a faith context. And that was all good. But then you start moving it towards meetings and then towards the building. And then you bring in some more of your Christian culture, like sacred worship space that's just doing what they did on Sunday in the big people's church with young people, because we haven't gone through any significant detox at all. we're being very, very, very excited about the freedom to explore a corner of the box. And that's largely what we were doing. In all of our moving towards where people were, we were still churched, and we still, though it was incredibly dynamic for us, and thank goodness it was, because it saved us from being too institutionalized and kept us moving, essentially it still was moving the furniture in the institution, albeit in a bar.
Mm. Mm. Is that that being churched, is that something you feel like you and others had received just from growing up in church, or was it something that was just imprinted through participating in this Christian milieu? Like, how deep does that go, and how deep is that how deep therefore is the deconstruction of that to be unchurched?
Well, I didn't really understand until later, when I was deconstructing, that I'd been constructed since birth. So I'm in a Christian culture, I'm christened, I'm in a family with parents who watch all the Bible movies with Charlton Heston on a Sunday while they fall asleep, but I'm still around ramming toy cars into stacks of yogurt cartons to wake them up and annoy them. But you're in an environment of a Christian culture and Christian storytelling, and so auntie buys you a children's story of the Bible, so that's part of, I don't want to say indoctrination, but it is. I didn't ask for it. There was no choice. I was brought up into a Christian culture from a very early age, though I didn't know it. And then on reflection, I realized I went to a preschool that was in a church hall. And then I went to a youth club that had a 10-minute Bible slot at the end of it. So there's a lot of drip feeding that can go on in the culture in the West to lay some foundations for you to have a sense of God, the idea of the divine. And even worse still, that you're special to God because you were born in England, and we used to rule more than half of the world, and that's because we were special, because you've got no concept of empire and colonialism clouded with Christianity yet, but that's another story.
Mm. Okay, so you find yourself at the radical edge of bringing church out of church.
Yes.
Basically, you have this view of like, this is the old, and we are participating in something new. We're taking church beyond the confines of what church has been, and you found that to be very enriching, it sounds like.
Exhausting and stimulating at the same time. Getting to be on Channel
Mm.
4's alternative Christmas morning service, and you get affirmed that you're doing something different because people are paying you attention.
And what was the climate like at that time as well? Because it definitely seems like the whole kind of the new atheist kind of moment didn't hit until the mid 2000s. And so I imagine in the 90s there was still like this sort of I say like sleepy nascent Christianity and mainstream culture maybe that hadn't yet entered into this much more like dominant atheistic um phase.
Yeah, I think, and some may or may not be familiar with this, there was some weird shit going on in the 90s to do with what we would commonly term to be moves of the Holy Spirit. So weird crap happening in different parts of the world. So I happened to be around a Christian community that was open to experiences, which again was nice and dynamic, even though I'm not entirely sure where to place them now or what they mean. But like there was the Airport Vineyard Church in Toronto, where so many Christians were going to that because they were touching something that was happening there. the church got the tourist award for Canada, that kind of dynamic of such a movement of people towards a specific place to touch it. And there was definitely a contagion that came out into different churches, which was probably slightly indulgent in we'd all been a bit bored and now we could lay on the floor and flap like a fish or clap like a chicken or blow bubbles with our mouth on aeroplanes and have to then, because that hasn't stopped for 2 years, have to get a doctor's certificate to say we've actually got a condition, but it's a manifestation of the spirit. Anyway, very interesting stuff going on. In amidst the plateauing, it brought a hope and a disruption. And on reflection, people have said, what was that about? Because it went on quite a lot through the 90s and affected quite a lot of churches, whether they were Anglican churches or happy, clappy, charismatic churches. And on reflection, people have said it was disruption. It tried to disrupt all of our order and control and see how we could cope with mess. And in terms of the institutional church being predominantly a structure, and whether we like it or not, the rebuilding of a temple where God is, or God is more, it was blowing that up. But unfortunately, what we did, because as a problem of social movements is our love of the familiar, is we grabbed all of those bricks and we put them back down, either in the same order, a slightly adjusted order, and said, wow, isn't God good? And we were less bored for another 5 to 10 years. So there was disruption in the 90s, which we participated in. And there was a lot of interesting stuff happening with young people, not having to do what their mum and dads did. But again, there's a difference to significant change versus dynamic adjustment and having fun. So I think I remained disrupted and didn't want to put the bricks back down.
I'm hearing like some really deep perennial tensions in what you've described of like how, I mean, it's just a desire in culture at large to have change, to have disruption. And then there's a desire for order. There's a desire to maintain the institutions that have been inherited, to update them rather than to do away with them entirely. And then sometimes those updates are just piecemeal offerings. Sometimes there's a more significant shift. It seems to me that the deepest shift happens, in our psyches, in our relationships to one another, in our kind of conceptual landscapes. Which aspects do you feel like were disrupted, and which ones, like, what are the qualities that remain unquestioned, undisrupted across the spectrum, no matter how cool revival, reform people have gone within church? Like, what do you is there kind of a line you can draw there between you feel like you've done something radical, but you're still ultimately inside of the thing, and what is that you're still inside of that you haven't questioned?
I've got a Who song in my head, which is nothing gets in my way, not even locked doors. I don't follow the lines that have been laid before. And I think I managed to keep at least some flavor of ongoing journey. So pretty much, if you look out on the landscape of all of the diversity of church, much of what is out there came out of what is, because what it was carrying, what dynamic revelation of something that was missing they got a hold of, wasn't received by the old. And so they came out with this new, fresh slice of God or divine or practices that were more liberating and freeing, and hopefully weren't just about them having a more dynamic, selfish experience in emotive theatre. but actually about being more integrated and contextual and becoming participants in society. However, what tends to happen is what I call the curse of the mission statement. And I think prior to our call, we were having a little chat about structures. And is that something that's external, or is it something that we carry with us? And I think it's very much something we default to and stuffs us every time. In that, every time we pay a high price to carry something new, it's crushed often and discouraged by the old. And so we do a very brave breakout. But as soon as we do, we don't realize that the patterns of conformity, the boundaries for safety come with us, and the internal need for structure over ongoing journey and exploration. And so very soon after, a bunch of people sit in a room and say, we should probably decide what the mission statement is, which they do. And half of what the mission statement is defining what they are as different from that lot over there they've just got away from. So they've now contributed to a sectarian landscape and division, or whatever that means. And they are, you know, two more evenings towards a construct where they're a bit like a, you know, they've now bought the bar, they've got the licensee, and he can have his name above the door, and it's called church, and they're now legitimate again, thank God, because they were a bit worried that they might wander, or oh gosh, if they stumbled across and created a heresy, when heresies traditionally come from the institution. So the pattern is there. You can see the pattern on the landscape in the diversity of the expressions of church, each breaking with the old to try and recover something new or be something new, and stepping straight into a centralized construct, rebuilding the temple, specialists on the platform, believing that the very best thing that they can do is keep you safe till heaven, draw you into sacred roles where leadership is about coming up to someone like you, saying, Jacob, how can I help you build up what I'm in? Instead of saying, hey, Jacob, what are you about? How can I help you get where you're going? Because our primary concern is the perpetuating of the construct,
Mm.
not our engagement and participation in society. Blah.
Mm.
And it's just suffocatingly small. Suffocatingly small. Which is why I'm on
Yeah.
ex-evangelical Facebook groups and who's that lot that only exist because Christians need to have an enemy? What are they called again? The people who don't believe in God?
I don't know. Atheists,
Yeah,
heretics.
atheists. There's no such thing as an atheist. It's what we call the people who aren't us, you know, which is why we think that atheist is like a counter church of non-believers when they're not anything. They're just doing life outside of our measure of what life is. So I love those
Mm.
groups because sadly for me, and I think this is perhaps a challenge in our conversation in exploring why some people are showing up on Sunday mornings in very traditional churches, is, I don't know. I don't think there is a construct. I think it's the worst thing that ever happened. I think it happened with Emperor Constantine very early on, a couple of hundred years into the Christian faith journey, where essentially the Roman Empire didn't die, it became the Catholic Church. Every aspect of church since then pretty much resembles the Catholic Church with some variations. And so that's construct, it's organization. And if we're not careful, it's also centralized empire that's positional, that feel we're here for everybody else and have no means of integrating and draw alongside as participants in society.
Mm. I picture like a it's like centering ourselves inside of the membrane, inside of the big cell, and then that every interaction with what's outside of that is mediated by our identity as like we're this membrane, we're church,
We are
we're the
well and you are unwell.
and therefore my interaction with you as an outsider is not, it's deeply mediated by the sense of this thing that I'm in that you're not in, and like how can I bring you into it. I mean, this is something I also saw when I was studying Islam. I think it's true of other religions as well. There's a um, quality of every encounter with that which is outside is based upon the assumed truth of that which is inside. And
Yeah.
so it's really about what's out there that's threatening to what I have here, and what's out there that I can bring in to further affirm, enrich, and strengthen what I
Yes.
have here. And so the thing ultimately seeks to perpetuate itself and to not be threatened, destroyed, or fundamentally transformed by
Yeah.
whatever it encounters outside of itself.
No. So I think I call it self-referencing. So the church is generally self-referencing, even if it's dynamic. We only invite people in who will either perpetuate and affirm what we already have, or offer us something that isn't too dangerous but gives us some sense of dynamism, or what I call the book that promises dynamic change that the last book promised but didn't. You know, we don't really want to change. We want people to affirm that we're doing well and that we're okay. So the opportunities for dynamic change are very limited. Actually, I was speaking to a lovely Scottish guy called David, who's kind of like church leader of leaders in my hometown, just a trusted, gentle person. Had his own particular ideas about church, but I remember saying to him, "I'm done," and he said, "What do you mean?" And I said, "Well, I have this idea that the church has just gone through 40 years of incremental adjustment, no significant change, and is therefore not a contributor to change in society. And if it's going to be another 40 years of incremental adjustments, I'm not hanging around. I want to get on and do something and join in." And he said, "Yeah," he said, "sadly, that's the reality. It's probably going to be 40 years and more of more incremental adjustments, each with a very high cost or perceived high cost to those people who are now rigidly locked into a particular set of beliefs and behaviors, limpets." So even small things come at a price. But so I don't, there's a bad word out there at the moment that's being demonized by the church as being snowflakers, people who are never Christians in the first place, called deconstruction. So those people are simply the people who've continued to ask questions and haven't found sufficient substance and have moved away from organized Christianity. What they've done is they've become dislodged, and now they've continued a journey where the church, whether you were in it to start with or arrive in it, is about having and presenting you with a destination. You've arrived. And so deconstruction at least enables some people to continue the journey, and the haters, the worst critics of it, would say, you know, if you deconstruct, you have to reconstruct, otherwise you deconstruct into oblivion. No, you deconstruct into space, you deconstruct into exploration, you deconstruct into discovery, you deconstruct into unknowing, which is where faith is. Faith is not in the known and the proven and the absolute. That's what's in church. That's not faith. And so anyone who's told me that they're really struggling with their faith and, you know, they're not in church, and everything I hear are people exploring faith and actually having faith because they don't know. They have some ideas. and they're exploring and they have inquiry, and the divine, for people who are looking for the divine, shows up in some shape or form or expression that is meaningful to them. And here comes the problem. Well, how can I measure that their faith is authentic? Well, it's not about you. It's about their measure of whether their faith is authentic, whether they feel they're having a journey with the divine, not filtered through some collective agreement of who's in and who's out. So I always thought that was a very dodgy thing when somebody was asked on TV about their faith and they said, I'm not going to answer because my faith is a very personal thing. Ah, he hasn't got one. He's being defensive. He's bullshitting. And I, just prior to this call, I was thinking, I'm much more there. I don't talk about this because nobody asks, and I'm not looking for people to talk to about it, unless I'm helping people detox and deprogram. But I did think today, what do I actually want to say? What if he asked me about my relationship with Jesus? I'm not sure I want to tell him. I don't want to tell anyone because it's mine. I'm working it out based on the fragments and the glimpses of something meaningful. And I'll shut up in a minute because I'm talking a lot because nobody asks me anything. And I've got ADHD, so don't ask me a question. But yes, when I came out of church as organization and faith as sorted out and handed to me, which isn't faith, I started referring to Jesus as the Jesus person. And for me, I was trying to humanize the divine. I was trying to see the activist in the dynamic cultural revolution that the Jesus person in the stories was portraying, and saying, you think it's this, but it's this, turning things on the head. You want to be a leader, you have to be a servant of all, tell Trump that. Just all of that stuff still had some meaning for me, but it's less to do with the divine, and any aspects of the divine are my own simple, private, fumbling, unknowing faith. And I'm really happy with it. And I am more happy with what I don't know than what it is some people think that they do know. And that's okay with me. So leave me alone.
I don't know if that's going to happen.
Oh,
Um, oh, okay. So I think the two biggest things I was hearing in that was this sense of safety and unsafety. Like I feel I being in church of some mainstream form, there's a sense of safety within it, and there's an
yeah.
unsafety without. And you've talked about how that's actually, insofar as there's an indoctrination going on, that's a significant piece of it. It's the inculcation of the sense that this is the safe place, and out there is perhaps the unsafe.
Why do
So
you think
don't.
that is? Where does that come from? What's the premise?
Mm, I think it could be a theological fear of the satanic, and a perception that things outside of Christianity are associated with that. I think it could also be that I can't remember who said this, might have been Young, um, that fundamentalism ultimately arises from the avoidance of doubt, and that when there's a doubt underneath that's being avoided, then there's this resort to kind of fundamentalism to cover it over. Um, and then I think, just like, to bring it down, really root it down, because we're getting into some degree of abstraction here. Like, I think it's ultimately people, and the kinds of people that are drawn to participate in those communities or become long-term figures in those communities. Maybe there is just more of landing in a sort of culturally introverted belonging and not being the kind of people that are most likely to put on their sandals and wander out into the
Mm.
unknown. Um,
It's definitely a sales pitch there. You know, Dyson, the Hoover guy, had to let us know that a dustpan and brush and all other versions of the Hoover prior to that were causing us to suffer and struggle. We didn't know the value of having a cyclonic system in our Hoover, but now we do, praise God. And I think the premise that, excuse my French, but if from birth you're fucked, is the premise. You're born in sin.
fallen, original sin. Yeah.
Yeah. So God's got something to do from the outset, and so have you. So you're fucked. What do you mean I'm fucked? Well, measured by this concept of God, you're now without him. You're born without him because of the fairy tale Adam and Eve, written by Moses 1,500 years later, retrospectively, as a patriarch, making woman a rib. Anyway, so what was I saying? I got in a bit of sarcasm there. I like to throw in a bit. What are we talking about?
I think the premise is that
You need something.
somehow the doctrine of original sin actually becomes the basis of a reliance on church.
You're fooked. Not only are you fooked, even if you get filled with the Holy Spirit, you leak and you need the petrol station on Sunday. So theology or the specialist at the church who's giving the Sermon on the Mount for the 15th time, even though the people who heard it on the sermon at the Mount only heard it once and had to take away 10% of it that was useful and inwardly digest it and make it muscle on bone by living it out in their lives because it was useful, you have to hear it 15 times because you're part of an education system that Jesus couldn't have graduated from. So it perpetuates a need of itself. And actually, what I'm finding in my client work is it really significantly contributes to people not self-actualizing. And I think we've had the conversation about how some of the things that we engage with in the processes are allowing trauma to become present so that we can be healed. And I said, what if we get well? So a lot of the things that we connect with, engage with, are focused on recovery, healing, trauma. And church system is set up on you perpetually having a need and being unwell, because if you grew up self-actualized, you wouldn't have need of it. So it's not really about that, in my view. But what we talked about, this separation that over here is safe and over here is unsafe, is called dualism. And it actually came in as the gospel came to the West through the Greeks, and you've now got Platonic thinking shitting all over journey by suggesting, what we've got here is the earth is entirely fallen and without possibility of redemption. And so we're going to create a sacred thing called the church, which is kind of intermediary. We perceive heaven to be up there somewhere, hell to be down here, or quite literally the earth. But we're going to create this sacred vehicle up here called the church that hovers above the fallen and is somewhere between the fallen and heaven. And you're going to need ministers and priests to administrate this, and who have more connection to the divine and therefore can instruct you as to the ways of what God is saying, even though the whole narrative, not the whole narrative, a primary narrative of the new covenant is Jesus dying on a cross, thunders, and a curtain being torn very vividly in the pictorial store in the temple that separated ordinary people from God, and only the priest could go in. So the priest tribe is now fucked. You're done. But in this inception, we've now reinstigated the temple, we've reinstigated the priests, earth is fallen. And so in the temple, you're nearer to the heavens and you're safe from the fallen earth. God is in the temple again. He is not in the fallen creation. And pretty much, whether we like it or not, that's that's the underlying belief system that we adopt. That church is safe, out there is unsafe, biblical is safe, outside the Bible is unsafe. And I don't know how I could help share this with you, but I had a friend who wrote a paper called Ethos 1 and Ethos 2. And he was saying if there's a crap Jesus and a loving, flowing Jesus, there has to be good church and bad church, good God, bad. He broke it down and said that if people are living out of a concept of God where God's will is a tightrope that we walk with fear and trepidation lest we fall, or God's will is a field in which we freely and boldly explore with the Holy Spirit. We could take both concepts from Christianity and the Bible, and yet one is control and fear and construct, and over here is safe and everywhere else is unsafe, and you better be careful lest you fall. Whereas here is a sense of journey and exploration and really good shit. And yeah, there's a reason that we think that. It's the way that the Christian message came to us in the West. But then you've also got expressions that were unbounded. And there's a book written by Chris Seaton and Roger Ellis, one more in construct now, one less orientated towards construct. But at the time, they were exploring what might rediscovering our Celtic spirituality bring back to our Sunday meetings and how we live our lives. And that was quite disruptive, because in the Celtic church was freedom to explore, get in a little boat, and where the wind blew them, that's where they would go and share the gospel. And it was a lot more fluid. And then the Catholic Church came to England and got upset with the indigenous church. And at I think it's Council of Whitby in England, we had an argument about where Easter was, sucked up, and then I'm simplifying things, and then became Catholic until Henry VIII. Which Henry was it? Henry VIII gets upset because you can't shag lots of different women and marry them, and says, okay, stuff you, papal system. I'm now setting up my own church in England called the Church of England, which didn't take us back towards Celtic spirituality. It was an adjustment, again, another adjustment to the largely Catholic system, which is what came out of the Roman Empire through the person of Constantine, also the person responsible for gathering people together to decide what stories made it into our library called the Bible and what narratives would remain dominant. Deeply suspicious. And if we simply inherit without inquiry, we become believers of a great deal of things and kiss our brains goodbye at the door, as some people have said for many decades now. And church is not a place to ask questions. And it's the church's responsibility, if you have a question, to have an answer. You are never going to find out someone in the church who says they don't know. And as you said, it's about knowing, it's about fact, it's about answers, it's not about faith, it's not about the unknown, it's not about journey.
Now I'm reminded of bumping into my old history teacher outside a church in Poole, St. James. I was surprised to find him there. He was a history teacher when I knew him, but I went to visit the church and he was there. Evidently, he had finished with the school, become started a curacy. It's like an entry level priest position, or whatever the equivalent in Church of England. And I remember like kind of alluding to him that I had been on this long journey with exploring and and wrestling with Christianity, and that I was having these really interesting dialogues about it, and some of the exploring how it relates to philosophy and plant medicine and so on. And all he could come up with was to ask me if I wanted to join the Alpha course,
Yeah.
and I couldn't help but laugh in that moment because it was like, I mean, yeah, it just felt like the perfect instantiation of never leaving the zone of the predictable, and that seems to be what's selected for in the ministerial pastoral class. And therefore, how are those people going to help others do the same if they themselves have never really undertaken the adventure?
The Alpha course brought a tremendous amount of people who had questions into the church to keep them safe to heaven, where they're probably quite useless for anything else. And now keeps them safe there, having provided them answers for their questions and a point of arrival, in my more critical opinion.
Mm.
Ha, well, tell me about the way, brother. Well, you should come to the Alpha course where you can bring your questions, and we have somebody in London at a big, big happy clappy church who has written a course for you to provide answers that you will believe. And I'll help you find faith, brother. Bollocks will help you find faith. It will give you a point of arrival and knowing
It
lots
will
of
help.
shit.
Yes, it will help you find answers. But
Yeah,
faith is something different, as you've spoken to. Faith is, I would say, fundamentally in relationship to the unknown. Um, and where can that be found within the church is a proper question. Um,
that's a good.
I think there's something to be said for the. It does seem like there's some sort of hero's journey kind of dynamic that's necessary in which people really, really leave, and then having gone on a journey and found the gold that they find in the unknown, then there's some degree to which they come back and communicate that um, with the church. And so I have some sympathy with the kind of consternation that they have around deconstruction,
Yeah,
because of course they don't want the Christian youth to all bugger off and
even though
completely
they
be done
will.
with. They will,
That's
probably,
the
many of them
statistic
do.
is that the majority of young people already in the church will hemorrhage out in their late teens because they're now experiencing the real, the culture of the here and now, and they can't reconcile the two worlds, recognizing that there are two. And they're in sin now. They've got non-Christian friends. Bloody hell.
Yeah, I think that's something that I think Daniel O.G. Rose spoke to that in one of our dialogues on pilgrimage, that the context of the early church was one in which people embarked on this journey as adults and they went outside of what they knew and really put a lot on faith. And the dynamic of growing up in the church is not something that was accounted for in that, like that. There wasn't that situation in the time of the early church necessarily of um, growing up completely membraned inside of the thing with all of the answers given. And that's a huge source of alienation for a lot of people. And I propose that a lot of the people who are like this revival, that the article in the Spectator that you sent about, I've been observing it for some
Mm.
time. Spectator always seems to be pretty early on to these kinds of trends. Um, that is a movement of people who have left behind church substantially or lived decades of their lives not as Christians or as atheists. and have wandered in questioning, and that those questions have kind of given way to deeper and deeper ground. And at some point, possibly in some sort of
Mm.
crisis or what have you, this Christ person, this Christ energy, this Christ symbol has started to literally come up through the ground of their
Yeah,
psyche. It started to come through the ground of their lives. And that is, um,
I like how you put that.
well, that's how it came for me. That's how it felt like. It wasn't that I sought it out
Probably not.
consciously. It was coming up through dreams and um yeah, visions, sort of emergences from my unconscious or something like that. And I think yeah, it's really difficult, the position. You've pointed to these problems of power and scale and empire, and that seems to be part of what's carried through from Rome, part of what's carried through from Catholicism, part of what we just can't seem to get away from, but there needs to be some sort of evolution in that. And there is always this feeling of, well, the early church was small groups of people. This is what OG Rose spoke to in our third dialogue in the series, was like the early
Mm.
church is a decentralized model. It's different
Yeah,
communities in different places, experimenting in relation to their context. And then they're like having some limited degree of communication with one another, which is like Paul
yeah.
writing letters to different communities. And they're trying to figure out, what does abiding by the Christological impulse mean in this particular context, without creating a universalized structure in which power kind of bubbles up to the top and then comes back down. Um,
How to do it without human hands and contagion. I honestly, so one of the jokes out there was you keep trying to get back to an original thing, but there was no original thing. They were all working it out and it was messy and they were buggering up, which is why most of the letters were written. You know, you were lucky to get a well done, good and faithful servants. More, it was like, what have you lost since the last time I came and hung out with you, you shitballs? You know, it's more like that. Um, and it was letters and instruction. And generally, you know, we've got a bloody great big book of letters written to someone else that we're trying to take from it what's relevant for us, or take it like that is actually for us. And so a letter might have been written to Corinth to chevy them along in exploring and integrating useful ideas and wisdoms and teaching. But the people in Corinth wouldn't have had the one that was written to the Thessalonians 500 miles away. They'd have got what they got, and they would have had to work it out and have progressed on their generational journey, some improvements. There was a beginning of a turning, there was a beginning of blessed are the meek, you know, not the celebrities, but blessed is the ordinary person instead of they're not scum at the side of the road. These are profoundly countercultural messages in the context that the Sermon on the Mount was, for instance. Um, or in the life of Brian, blessed are the cheesemakers. Wow, brilliant film. But back back to something you said earlier, which was about people who have perhaps been outside of what has the name church, perhaps for decades, finding some intrigue and place for it again. I don't think anyone going back into the construct can make a contribution. They were neither watching your journey, neither do they want to hear anything that's counter to what they already have. So you're not really giving something back. The vast majority of people who are revisiting the church that is on the landscape, that has the name, that has some sense of the sacred or the divine being there, because that's where they were told he was, are sitting there, often in non-happy, clappy, destiny type churches, often in religious, traditional settings, which you might refer to as meat and two veg, as we English say. There's no hype, there's no bullshit, just baseline, somebody telling you stuff from the Bible and a word of encouragement, is singing a song to give you slight emotive feelings and positivity and energy. But my aspiration and hope, as I look on at a distance of the people who are dipping back in, is that they've discovered that what is there is blue or green. That what they've explored is church and journey and expression as a whole spectrum of colours of the rainbow. The trouble is that the church has told you it's the rainbow. It's got everything you could ever need there. There's nothing you need outside of it. But the people who are branched out of it and wondering if this has any place is often, my life is now this. I have a spectrum of colours and experiences in my journey, but I recognise that can contribute blue. And that has meaning and purpose for me. So I'm going to connect to that blue in the spectrum of my experiences. Which brings me to the other bugger up, which is your bubbling up Jesus person and a sense of that divine essence is because you've moved away and out and explored. You're integrating that into a broad spectrum of positive, useful, helpful things. The church has no capacity to integrate in much, if anything, of all the beauty in the spectrum of experiences that you've got. It's deeply suspicious of most of what you've explored and you've journeyed and found meaning and worth in. and I just think going back to find the answer there is creating a very two-dimensional reality, a world of two colors, black and white, in or out, secular, sacred, divine, and all of that shit again. If people are integrating a past experience of familiarity around divine spaces, because we were talking about spaces that have dimension and dynamics and to our psychology and being, it's all important. Good on them. My problem is I don't think it should have been there in the first place, but I have to respect that it got us here, some of us here. It's still irrelevant to most 99% of the people in my street. Wow, not here, because I'm in Greece, and probably 99% of the people in my street believe in God and they're Orthodox. And that's a belief. And I'll let them have their beliefs. They can believe it. But it's not the same as journey. And it's just a shame that the whole God concept is restricted to a building, a time and a space, ministry gifts, when all of that could have been wonderfully scattered there's a bit in the Bible that I don't read the Bible. There's a bit in the Bible because I went to school and I remember some of it, my 15 years. What's the word when you leave? I graduated. No, you must read the Bible. I couldn't live without reading the Bible. Oh, I'm sorry. That's your fault. I live quite fine. I brought some of it with me that was useful and it's still helpful. Thank you. Oh, God, that's the red bus syndrome of ADHD. I thought that was fun and I've run off and followed it and now I can't remember where I was. What was I talking about? Yeah, you any idea? Were you listening? You bloody dialogos. Were you listening, Jacob? Were you witnessing?
Yes. We were talking about reading the Bible. There's an interjection I've meant to make some time back that I'm just going to make now instead. Because I think you've touched on the core question of this whole the zeitgeist of wrestling with Christianity, of imagining, of holding space for a Christianity beyond itself, as I've been calling it. Um,
I like that.
I like it too. I what I like about it is that it holds encounter. It's kind of it's a Christianity grounded in encounter with the unknown. Fundamentally, it's always in relate. It's very similar to that dialogical relationship. It's always like you can't be a good practitioner of dialogue without coming into relationship with the other and the unknown, with an openness to being changed, um, to mutual transformation. So um, I'm careful to say, like, we have been talking about the church at large. Where did the church go wrong? But there's, of course, many, many, many different churches
Hmm.
of different qualities, different people in them. I'm careful to say that it's impossible, partly because I'm holding a hope that there is some greater meeting point down the line between the Christianity beyond itself that I and others are bearing and the people who are holding up the flag and maintaining the building. Um, Maybe you're right, and I believe that's been the case of your experience and a lot of the people you're speaking to. But I also believe that holding the space of hope that something else is possible is there. And so I'm sitting right now at this place of cultivating this thing in the wild and knowing in my heart that part of its realization is some greater experience of communion, communing, whether that takes the form of a snapping into a permanent institutional mode and creating a mission statement and a hierarchy. I don't know. I hope not. I hope it can maintain more of
Hmm.
the circularity that I associate with early churches. Um,
Like that circularity.
but I'm still deeply unsure whether how this plays out is that there is some sort of opening to afford a connection between what I'm in and what churches are in, on the basis of mutual faith and perhaps even on the basis of mutual necessity, because I think a lot of the church leaders who are actually watching the limit are there because they see something's off. All the kids are leaving. There is something that we need to dig deeper into or to find, and we need to take seriously at the very least why all the kids are going to plant medicine or psychedelics or going into philosophy or what have you. Um, so is it that there's some dialogue? Is there some meeting? Am I going to be able to bring my God-informed rap music into some sort of church space? Or is it really the case that I'm going to have to co-create the thing with others and have it be a new thing and work it out in that way? And I just don't know. But that's the
I
juncture that I'm facing at this moment.
I know that we
And
both share.
it's about being in that journey throughout. That's absolutely core
Yes.
for me. Yeah.
So to hit the dualism, God separated off from life, God in the building, people in the building, work is just something you have to do. Um, so there's a bunch of nice people in Wales, and we can interact with each other and say challenging things that transform our thinking and practices. And what was coming out of this bunch in Wales was, what does it mean to be the fullness of Him in education, fullness of Him in healthcare? Basically, what does it mean to be the fullness of Him in all the places we don't ask that question, which is where 90% of us actually work and live and have our breath? And it was based on the premise that God set Jesus over the church, which is His body, the fullness of Him. in and through all things, in all and all, in and through the creation. And so when I left church as a building to pursue it more as a journey, I had a friend encourage me that it's okay, because at some point people will have explored all of the possible corners in the box, and some people will look out into the land. And it's good if they can find people standing there who can say, God is here, it's good here, it's safe. I don't know why I was saying that. Yes, I did. Because everything that the church has, its money, its human resources, its leadership, its spiritual gifts and practices are bound up in a building and in a program that's in the diary. And you have to go and engage with it. Because we have church as a construct, much of what is useful about it is not dispersed and spread in and through, alongside, in the institutions of healthcare. So when I did used to talk to groups of people, I used to ask them what are the spheres of society, and would write on the board. And you'd have family, healthcare, business, the school gates, all of these. Always they put church. And the problem is that I don't believe church was ever to have or occupy its own sphere, but was meant to be the fullness of Him in and through all things, as image bearers, as value shifters, as carer, nurturers, restorers, non-positional, but alongside, not how can I help you build up what I'm in, but how can I help you get where you're going? What do you need? What are you about? All of these things are transformational, and they're about not being leader, not being positional, but about being servant. So there's some transformational stuff there, but it's all held up in a bit building, a meeting and program, and specific roles that you have to get engaged with. And so I'm at a critical point of ongoing inquiry. What would it look like if it wasn't there? And all of that was dispersed through. And there's loads of stuff in that book about being the yeast in the flour, in the leaven to make the bread. And it's about dispersal, but we're not dispersed. And if we are dispersed, we put very little meaning and value and purpose there, because all the meaning, value, and purpose is measured in proximity to the thing. And I don't think it's redeemable. I think at its core, it is counter to the Christian journey. It may yet contribute, but not as center. It can be support at best, and will make a move forwards towards integration, being alongside participation in society, bringing any Christ values to helping our neighbor, or having an entrepreneurial idea that solves the shit show of healthcare in Britain. So I don't know if it's redeemable. At best, it can play a part. It's too sectarian, too cut off, too elitist, too scared. I consider myself a trying feminist, and I encourage Christian women to please stop looking for the croutons in the vast empty space of the soup bowl, which is the Bible, that can affirm you as a woman. At best, Jesus just about spoke to countering the entire patriarchal narrative that is the Bible. And actually, thank God, if you like, that the world has moved on without the church, because the church is still wondering whether a woman can talk on a Sunday or serve communion. That's not being in and through and transformative and playing your part in your contribution in society. That's a huge distraction. And I think that's what I experience is I'm going, wow, this is the world. This is life. This is mess and chaotic and brilliant. And I'm exploring over what was so small by comparison, and for some, suffocating.
Wonderful. This has been very thought-provoking. I really like where you've ended up, that kind of rounding off point that church cannot fundamentally be the center of Christ. Feels like a really deep, radical distillation of what you're bringing to this conversation. And yeah, forward to letting this one ripple out. And so, thank you very much for sharing stories and humor and uncertainty. And
Can I chuck in a
yeah,
couple of eggs before I go? One was the best thing of COVID lockdown was a post going around with Willy Wonka, and it said, "You keep saying church is the people, but you keep calling that building the church." And I thought that was really clever because we do. Oh, anyone who's in will listen to this and go, "But oh, we all know that church is the people, but that's not how you live." And the other one, I think, is the critique of people who have, let's call this deconstruction journey, the people who have moved towards journey. The criticism is the church in its construct is saying, where's the new thing? So that we can judge it and legitimize it. And quite possibly, there is no new thing. What we are discovering is a way of being, of participation, of integration in society and alongside others, and perhaps not simply connecting on faith, perhaps even more connecting on shared values, and faith can be part of that. And I think what could happen is a very different world where faith is useful to other people, not simply to us and the people who believe. And the other thing is thank Jesus for Talladega Nights. Because without Talladega Nights, when people are telling me I don't understand how you can live without reading the Bible and you should read the Bible more, I wouldn't have a voice inside my head that says, "Don't you be putting that on me, Ricky Bobby," which helps me deal with the onslaught of wise and clever suggestions. We get to have our journey, and I think we do have a word for people who are still have a place for the Jesus person, and that's faith. And it's largely about the unknown and exploring, not hiding, not being safe. Ta-da!
I'd
Thank.
like to thank baby Jesus.
Which one?